Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm amazed to see so many people here. I believe we're clashing with David Attenborough, so thank you for coming. Sorry, it was sold out, that's why you couldn't get in. Is that what it was? So we have an esteemed panel of feature documentary makers with many BAFTAs, BIFFAs, Emmys between them, and James as well as a first-timer. But perhaps we could start, if we start from this end of the table, with John, who started his career in feature documentaries some time ago. Was it back in 2000, John?
No, not that long ago.
2003.
2003. Yeah, you asked me earlier how many I'd done, and I sat down and worked it out. So this is my 7th feature doc, the 4th of which to actually get a cinema distribution deal, although one of those 4, not this one, shouldn't have got a distribution deal. Shouldn't have gone in the cinema, as shown by the fact that no one went to see it. 2 of them were feature-length documentaries made for television, but still went on the big screen at festivals like this one. And then one of them was feature-length made specifically for the BBC, which shouldn't have been feature-length. It should have been no more than 60 minutes.
Can we name these films, John? Which one?
I'm happy to. The film that shouldn't have been... shit. The film that shouldn't have been 89 minutes long for the BBC was... In fact, the title of the film was even wrong. It was a film about the last 7 days of Kurt Cobain and the people that he bumped into when he was officially a missing person, and the people that claimed to have bumped into him. The BBC renamed it The Last 48 Hours of Kurt Cobain because they thought that was snappier. And it shouldn't have been more than, I'd say, 59 minutes long. And the one that shouldn't have been in the cinema was another great title, Once in a Lifetime, The Extraordinary Story of the New York Cosmos.
And what about the ones that should have been in the cinema?
Well, this one, which is screening here tomorrow afternoon. What? Is it? I've got 2 here, so you get one. There's one for you. And then we could raffle these to the end, couldn't we?
Well, we're going to be talking about selling out later, so...
I did that a long time ago.
Yeah, we'll move on to that. But the film you have here, John, is...
It's called My Scientology Movie, which has recently got a cinema distribution deal, so you will be able to see it in cinemas, hopefully, in October, I think.
And this is a film fronted by Louis Theroux, his first venture into feature documentaries as well.
His first feature doc.
Shall we watch a clip?
Yeah.
So the film, it premiered at the London Film Festival.
In October, yeah.
Went on to Tribeca.
Yeah. Has been released theatrically in Holland and Belgium. Belgium, where I've discovered, I kid you not, Louis has some sort of godlike status. It was like travelling with One Direction. Everywhere you went with him, he got mobbed. And there's even a square in Brussels which has a huge picture of him on one of the old civic buildings. Very strange.
Interesting. But I was at the screening here the other day, and when you got up on stage afterwards, you mentioned that you turned this film down 2-3 times?
3 times.
And Louis said that you like saying that, and various Q&As.
I don't like saying it, but I think it's, it's... Yeah, I mean, I don't know how well it reflects on me. A film
why produced you say that
by double Oscar-winning producer Simon Chin, national treasure Louis Theroux. I mean, what an idiot.
But why did you turn it down?
I think because, or partly because, well, specific to this panel we're on now, this was a film which is unusual. I mean, I guess it's in that it had to be a cinema documentary. We are making this. This is our guy from BBC TV. We want to make his first film. It's got to go into the cinema. That's, from the get-go, before you've even, sat down and talked about it, that's quite a lot of... I found that quite intimidating. And especially given there was no access, no subject, no real idea of a film. So it was quite... But once I got over myself, I did it.
But what convinced you?
Well, I think me and Louis, you know, we agreed we had to come up with a concept. Before I came on board, there was a trailer, or a taster, I think as they're called now. I've just done my first ever taster, as you know. There was a taster, but for me it felt a bit like Louis on TV. And I came up with this quite a banal analogy, really, but it's like, you remember the sitcom Porridge? Well, they had, you know, Porridge was a TV series, and then made Porridge the movie, and it was just kind of a 90-minute version of the half hour, and it didn't feel like a movie. And that was, we had to come up with something that would justify this eventually, maybe, hopefully, playing in a cinema, and expecting people to come and pay, you know, £11.50 to, which is a big deal. You know, when X-Men 3 is playing next door.
Well, we can talk a bit about what that is later, but if we can move on to Louise now. Louise, again, you've been making feature docs for a while, starting with, your first one would have been...
First one was back in 2006. I did kind of a couple, one feature doc and one that was a television that went into festivals, and then I kind of went back into...
And that was?
Beckoning Silence.
Okay.
And then I kind of went back into TV and was doing feature-length programs for TV, and then escaped again to make feature documentaries, and made Dark Horse, and then this year Versus.
And Deep Water as well?
That was back in 2006, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so Dark Horse obviously had a great reception at Sundance, and was it that gave you the, I suppose, bug to go out and make more feature documentaries? Or had you already moved on in your mind from television to feature films?
I think I loved doing it the first time. I love cinema. I love that sort of concept of telling stories in the dark, to an audience in the dark. So I was really keen to do it again. I think it can be such a train. Working in TV, you know, you're thinking about the next job, and you can I probably stayed doing things that I perhaps was less keen on. I should have probably tried to come back into this world earlier. But so when I think the story for Dark Horse was the impetus to do it. It was something we'd found. We could take it to people, which is always a kind of great... If you have a calling card, which is a good story, it helps you get back into the world, because people will have meetings with you, particularly if they want to make the feature film. So that was the route back in, basically.
And can you tell us a little bit about Versus, the life and films of Ken Loach, which is the film that you have here?
Yes, Versus came up kind of pretty quickly on the back of Dark Horse, and that was Ken Loach's producer, Rebecca O'Brien, decided she wanted to make a film about him. And so she approached me to do that. And we had kind of many very interesting discussions about how that would work, because obviously it was kind of unusually close for Ken's producer, who was simultaneously producing his film I, Daniel Blake, to be producing a documentary that would need to be independent about him. So anyway, we had a lot of good conversations about how that could work, and key to that was, you know, having a crew, head of department, DOP, and editor who would be absolutely independent with you, and I brought those people on, and both of them are big characters who can, you know, they're completely sort of, Joby, the editor, independent guy, will absolutely make his own film anyway.
Is he here, Joby? No.
No, he's probably drinking somewhere, I should.
It was his 50th yesterday, so he probably
Yes,
is.
indeed, yes.
And so what convinced you that there was a film to make about Ken Loach? And why did the producer want the film made in the first place?
Well, she had, actually, it sort of came about in one of those classic documentary ways, is Ken donated his archive to the BFI. And some of the boxes that were en route to the BFI were in 16 Films offices. And she was going through some stuff and was saying to Ken, what's this, what's this? And he said, well, that's when I got banned for this, and that's when I fought these people about that. And it just went on, and she just realized there was actually a very interesting story in him, which there was. And interestingly, at first I think I was quite interested in the idea of the chance to kind of follow a filmmaker like him for a year. Seemed an interesting opportunity. But when we started to research the film, it just had this kind of extraordinary narrative structure of its own. He'd had great highs and great lows. He'd had periods in the wilderness when he couldn't get arrested, could get nothing broadcast. So it actually seemed that there was a story that could live on its own on the big screen, which I think is very important, because I felt in those early discussions that if it was just a kind of clip show, it wouldn't have a life on the big screen. And if it was a making of, it wouldn't have a life on the big screen. So we needed to find a way that it could have a kind of dramatic narrative of its own. And
what was that? Or how did you find that?
Well, essentially, it became a story of kind of layers, kind of moved across time and place. So it was sort of telling two past tense stories. It had a present tense strand. And essentially what it's doing is following through his life, the influences on his life, and his career, and then threaded through that is the story of him setting out to make the film, which, as luck would have it, won a Palme d'Or just before we came out. Great marketing. Thank you, Ken.
Okay. Shall we see a clip? So I'm just interested to know what the challenges of making a film about a filmmaker are, and also how you stop it. And I think with many of the films, I suppose, that we're discussing, or films that we've all made, when we've made films with people who are very well known, how you stop it from being a massive love-in for them.
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, the difficulty with this film was that Ken is very kind of private, self-contained character. Actually not at all the sort of person you choose to make a film about. And he was also, I would say, pretty ambivalent to the film. I think his producer had browbeaten him into doing it. So in the beginning, I pretty much kept my distance, because one early lesson I'd been taught was you never rush a no. And but it also got, the sort of deeper it got into preparation for the film, the easier it was to follow him, simply because there was action. They would be going on recce's in the very early stages when they're working on the script, etc. It's really hard because it's just people in a room, and he found that very kind of difficult. So I kind of did the opposite of what I would normally do. Normally I would know the interviewees pretty well. I would have formed a relationship with them before doing the interviewees. But actually in this instance, we kind of met in the interviews really for the first time. And he had carved out time in his schedule to do the interviews. So once he'd agreed to do that, he was kind of committed, and he would sit down and do it. And was very generous in the way he kind of spoke and was open. But yeah, it was interesting. It was a kind of...
So the challenge was that he was reluctant to do it?
Yes, and then sort of constantly evasive. You sort of learnt that if you'd ask him if you could come and film a particular thing, and you learnt pretty quickly that the minute he sort of raised an eyebrow that might be taken as consent, you would just leg it as fast as possible before the sort of doubt started to feed in, and he would then have backtracked. And so it was just different. It was just kind of having to I mean, Ken's used to controlling every aspect of his world. So our presence in that was quite
And did you feel his scrutiny as a filmmaker?
I have to confess, I mean, probably because of his own experiences, he's had some tremendous battles of censorship as well. So I think we were, 16, Rebecca and Ken were kind of true to their word that we were completely left alone. He didn't. I think around Christmas time he raised an eyebrow and asked how it was going, but that was about it. They left us alone, which was good.
But even so, in terms of your choice of contributors, and a man who is generally well-loved, is it hard not to make a film which is just an entirely positive portrait of him?
Well, Ken, I mean, that section looked quite positive, but actually Ken can have an argument in an empty room, which is a good starting point. So I think actually just bringing to life Ken's own personality is he's a complex character. There are many layers to him. So I think in a sense we were using what he'd done, the actions he'd taken through his life, the battles he'd had, the way he'd been perceived when he took those battles on, and actually I hope and think that it's not a hagiography, that it's more a kind of exploration of this character and his work over 50 years. There's some people in the film stick it to him.
Okay. And then, Anthony, your journey into feature documentaries, can you tell me a bit about that?
I was very privileged to be at the BBC, and they let me make a series that spread over 3 years called The Tower, and after that it just felt like a natural thing to do, whereby you can actually be the director. And there was a lot of television that was being made at that time, which was kind of, there was a lot of reality shows and fixed rigs and stuff like that, and I just thought I didn't actually want to do that. I wanted to try to still stay as the director in control of the film.
So you felt with those other forms of television that you weren't in control?
It wasn't so much that. I think I was really spoiled at the BBC, and I could see things on the horizon. And plus I saw Man on Wire, and I thought that was great and really inspirational. I thought, and you know, this is an English guy that has gone on to win an Oscar and do an amazing film, and you thought, well, that's encouraging. And I was offered a feature doc, so that also helped, which in the end didn't even get distribution and got kind of a minimal kind of outing. So
and that was Gymnast?
That was Gymnast, yeah, with BBC Film. So that was quite a good lesson to learn, that they, even though you invest a hell of a lot of time and money and effort into something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to live this theatrical life that you have an ambition for.
And this was a film following the British gymnastic team on their way to Beijing, and then following them at Beijing as well?
Yeah. No, we had access to the Olympics, was there for 8 weeks, and went through the whole selection process with them for about a year, and was there when they were told whether they were going or not. There was lots of tears and emotion, and you know.
And why didn't that see the light of day?
I don't know. I mean, it's just one of those things. Maybe because at the time I think there might have been a spirit of documentaries that had to have a good feel-good factor, and I think they didn't win. They came 7th, and their big thing was that they qualified, and that's not exactly kind of when you go to the cinema you think, oh my God, they came 7th. So you know. Maybe that, I don't know. I mean, you know, everyone who saw it was very happy with it, and they liked it, and BBC Films really liked it. But
wasn't it a soul-destroying experience, or why did you come back for more?
Well, because I just think, you know, you kind of, I've had films that made for TV that for legal reasons never saw the light of day, you know, and you kind of, I think one of the good things about TV is it's quite rigorous, and it, you know, you have to ride with the punches, and you know, there's a high turnout of content you've got to come up with, and it's a great learning ground. And so I think you just have to think, okay, this is, if you're going to make that investment, if you really want to do it, you realise that you just have to keep on doing it. And you've got to be tenacious. It's not easy.
And you were tenacious and went on to make several films, 2 of which have come out this year or last year.
Last year, November, yeah.
Both about very big sporting stars. One is Being AP, about AP McCoy, the jockey, and the other Ronaldo, about the footballer Ronaldo.
Yes.
And so you were making those films simultaneously?
Yes.
At the same time. And that must have been very challenging, but also to be making 2 films about uber sporting stars that must come with, I suppose, its own set of challenges. Firstly, I imagine in terms of access, and secondly, in terms of elevating that film, as I imagine you would want to do, beyond something that would simply appeal to the sporting fans, the natural fan base that those films have.
I mean, I think that's the thing with, like, you know, when people ask about what makes a feature doc, and especially something like that, I think you've got to look at something that's beyond its constituent parts, and you don't, you know, I think it was a saving grace and an advantage that I'm not a massive football fan. I mean, I used to play, but I'm not a partisan fan, and I told Ronaldo that pretty much early on, and I know nothing about horse racing, and I'm completely uninterested in horse racing, but either way, I kind of looked at that and thought, well, you know, there is a time, and if you get access to these 2 guys, they are going through quite fundamental, big, defining things in their life at that time. And if you're there to be able to capture it and you know, and put it in the cinema, then you know, it would be a great thing to do. But that was, I suppose with Ronaldo, you don't want to do 90 minutes of kind of stepovers of like, his greatest goals.
There's not much football in it.
There's not much football in it, no.
But that was a conscious decision.
Yeah, that was a conscious decision and a financial decision as well. But yeah, the idea was, I mean, our producer, James Gay Rees, who did Senna and Amy, he was like, can you make the film with no football? And I was like, yeah, no. But, you know, you have to see the kind of like the majesty of him play, because ultimately, you know, when you do, I suppose it's, we consciously cut it and shot his football in a very different way. But when you see that, you ultimately, and that's partly what ends up in the film at the end, is that you realise that his actual talent and his prodigious talent and skill is what fundamentally affects his whole family.
And at the end of the film, I think it's fair, I don't think I'm giving much away, but there is a montage, if I'm allowed to call it that, of his skill and talent.
Yeah.
But you sort of saved that right to the end.
Yeah, you deliberately saved that at the end, which is, you know, is partly sort of the grammar of film, that you want to kind of build to something that has a big emotional payoff at the end, or that somehow sort of distills or crystallises what the film is about. You know, which I think in television it does in different ways. It's a different sort of grammar, but...
And so are you trying to make a film which is about, it has more of a theme, there's whether it's sub-narrative, or whether it's kind of overtly this is what the film is about other than the sport? And,
yeah,
and if it is, what is it with Ronaldo and what is it with AP?
Well, I think Ronaldo was kind of like, it was harder because he was just doing very well, so it was never going to be about his failures, and he doesn't really fail. But it was more about the kind of the loneliness of this person and the sacrifice he made, and the fact that, you know, and about trust, and that ultimately the person that he trusts the most is this surrogate son that he has, which he's kind of, you know, which is his only really sort of true solace, I think, that he has in life when he's a particularly sort of lonely guy. And with AP, it was about a guy who is retiring, and for someone who has to give up something that has defined him for all his life. And that in itself is something that I think of, you know, any person, especially men in their mid-40s, they kind of think about telescopically, you know, what's on the horizon, and it just so happens with sports people that I think a sports psychologist once said the thing about sports people is they die twice, and that's a very interesting space to be in as a filmmaker if you're there capturing that decision. And then I realised actually that if that's the heart of the film, is about a decision that ultimately people will, you know, have to make at some point in their life. How does that decision not only affect him but also his wife? And I realised then that this is actually a film about a marriage as well. So in that sense, I wanted it to be about these sort of universal things that hopefully people who had no interest in racing would go to.
Right. Can we see a clip? So it's interesting watching that. We don't, obviously he's on the horse, but we don't see him in vision in the interview. And actually, with both films, with Ronaldo and with Being AP, you've made the decision not to do the kind of classic to-camera interview, or you've covered those interviews with pictures.
There's a few times we cut to AP in vision, but yeah, no, it was a conscious decision. But more with Ronaldo, the reason we did a series of wild tracks, is that I did do interviews with him on camera, and what I realised is that, you know, Ronaldo has been filmed voraciously from the age of 11. And has a very strange relationship with a camera, and that was, I think, one of the battles is about
what is that relationship?
Well, just that it kind of hounds him consistently all the time. I mean, when we go out to places, if it's a kind of event or whatever, you know, he gets from his private car or his entourage and he goes in, and he's just swarmed, and it's swarmed by television cameras. He's swarmed by people who want selfies from him, swarmed by people, you know, on their phones, and so he's constantly being filmed. And I think that relentlessness over the years has you know, he's created a kind of barrier around him. So the times when I would be filming him on camera, I think there'd be a part of him that I didn't really believe. And so we made the conscious decision. I said, okay. And I just said this was part of the process. I didn't allude him to that, my trickery, if that was, you know, what it is. And I said, we'll do a series of wild tracks. And, you know, he has a room in his house, and we turn the lights down, and he lay down on a couch. And and it was just me and Ronaldo for like these sessions, and we did about 8 one-hour sessions. You know, with
why isn't that in the film?
Well,
there's still photographs of it, but it was quite surreal.
And both films are striking for the intimacy with which you achieve. And I think, you know, particularly with Ronaldo, you're there when he's getting ready, shaving, getting changed.
In the shower.
In the shower with Ronaldo, all of that. So, but how do you achieve that? And did you have to make any compromises in order to get that level of access? Because I think most of us would assume that when you're dealing with a star of that level, that there are various gatekeepers that you have to get through in order to get that, and that there are probably deals that you have to do in terms of what you will and won't talk about.
Well, I got asked to do it. I went and pitched for it and was interviewed by Universal and the producers of, who did Senna and Amy. And I think that helped get through the door with Ronaldo. They'd been negotiating with him for about a year and a half with his people. And then they had, their treatment was basically 3 days worth of filming with him. And it was a very conceptual idea about what Ronaldo is as a world phenomenon and is there a film out there? And then I think, okay, great. That's not a lot to go with, but we'd all came down to our first meeting, and we met in our team was in a hotel, and we saw this kind of 4 blacked out, 4x4s come snaking down into the hotel, and it was his people, and they were all dressed in suits. They look like the mafia, and they are the kind of mafia of football. And they were nervous, because they're going to go and see King Ronaldo. And we go, and we end up going to George Mendes's, one of his houses, and I see Ronaldo, and there's another group of agents in suits and mobiles and everything.
This is his manager, George Mendes.
This is, George Mendes. And Ronaldo is sitting on a sofa which is about 3 times the length of this thing together, with his arms outstretched, wearing diamonds and the whole thing, with a couple of other footballers, watching himself on a big plasma screen, and I'm thinking, shit, this is not going to be great. And I go and shake his hand, and he kind of gives me this who are you? And and I'm just thinking, this is going to be a nightmare. This guy's really not going to give us anything. And we sat down, and for some reason, and I said, do you mind if I start recording this? And he was a bit perplexed. But I got the sound man in, and it just so happened the sound man looked a lot like his best friend. So they kind of that broke the ice. He thought it was really amusing. And we started talking, and I started recording the conversation. And I asked him a question, he didn't stop for 50 minutes. And it completely changed my attitude of him. He's a very smart guy, bright and funny, and was not what I expected. And I think at the end of it all, I sort of said, look, I know that we've got this arrangement in place, but I think there's something more we can do. And I kind of had to make it up as I went along with him. And his agent was there, and it kind of developed. So what was originally proposed as a film that would have 2 days filming with him turned into kind of spending nearly just under a year and a half with him. So it morphed. I can't remember how many it was. It was quite, we could have had more if we didn't wait to make decisions. But the problem was a lot of money was spent because, you can't legislate for his time. His main priority is football, and it's just, that's the culture in football, that there are lots of people waiting in hotel rooms.
So you don't get necessarily the time that you wanted with him, and you've hired the crew, and you're waiting around.
Yeah, and it's nail-biting. I mean, we had 8 big cameras, 4K cameras, and trying to get access to the Clásico, which Real Madrid and Barcelona had never given before. And the day before, we still didn't have the green light, but we shipped out 8 cameras, subsequent crews and everything. So it was quite nail-biting, and in the end it worked out, and it paid off. But there was a lot of that. There was a lot of kind of hoping that the budget would absorb it.
And obviously you need the budget to be able to do that, and one of the main ingredients for a feature documentary is the cash.
Yeah.
And so what would we be talking for Ronaldo, all being AP?
Around about sort of the 2-ish, around about 2-ish million. So both about the same, something along those lines.
You lucky bastard.
But to be in all fairness,
why do people not like talking about the budgets?
I don't know.
What was the budget of your film, John?
It was, I think it was just over 1.
1 million?
Yeah.
And that came from?
All BBC.
All out the BBC, but
well, it came from. I mean, the BBC's a big entity, so it came from BBC Docs, BBC Films, and BBC Worldwide.
Louise, can I ask you with the Ken film as well?
Yes, Ken was $650. I'm the cheapskate here, and Dark Horse was $850.
Okay, and that came from?
That came from Film 4 and the BFI matched. Film 4, Channel 4 split, and they matched BFI. And Ken was BFI and BBC Films.
Okay.
But you wouldn't have had to pay for any of your archive in that, would you?
You must be kidding,
You
yeah.
had to pay for his film clips.
Yeah, well, Ken has a very... I shouldn't really be talking
All right,
about
sorry,
this.
I won't get that. I'm sorry, I'll ask you that afterwards.
Yes, afterwards, quietly, yes.
Okay,
Ken has quite a ballsy producer.
everyone needs a ballsy producer.
Yes.
James, did you have a ballsy producer? There's two of you, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Your other half isn't here.
My other half isn't here. No, I directed the film with Peter Middleton. We began working on it about 5 years ago, and we were researching another project, and we came across, we were researching testimonies of blindness. We came across a book called Touching the Rock, which reads like a diary. And in the foreword to the book, it mentions that it was transcribed from these audio recordings that John kept in the early 1980s.
Should we go back? So it's your first film.
Yep.
It's called Notes on Blindness.
Yep.
It's playing here, and it grew out of a short film that you made, which showed at the Hot Docs Festival, which I think I met you there like 3 years ago. And then, well, maybe you could tell me the journey after that. So there's a short film, and if you could tell us about the subject of that short film, and then how it grew into the feature doc that's playing here.
Sure. So the short film just took a single diary entry from John's diary about how the sound of rainfall brings a sense of shape and depth to the environment. And we made that short film really as an attempt to kind of demonstrate the quite unusual approach that we were taking to it, in that it has a documentary heart to it, in that the voices in the film are the voices of John and his wife and his family, but on screen they're played by actors in order to allow us to access this kind of internal world that he describes of his fading memories and his dreaming life and things like that.
Just John, tell me a bit about John, because how did you come across who he was and how you came across this archive?
Yeah, so John was an academic. He was a theologian. In the early 1980s, he became blind, having struggled with sight loss all his life. And after kind of readjusting to the kind of practical challenges of blindness, after a few years he was hit by the kind of emotional losses, and at that point he began keeping a diary and audio cassette in order to try and understand blindness. And he kept it across 3 years. And it sort of forensically analyses what it means to lose faces, to lose smiles, eye contact, dreams. His dreams remain visual even after several years of becoming totally blind. And then across this 3-year period, it kind of documents this transformation in his whole state of consciousness. So though he begins from a position of grief and loss, by the end of the diaries, he's come to view blindness as a paradoxical gift around which he's redefined his life. And yeah, the diaries were published as a book, and we met John, and he was a very, very eloquent and wonderful speaker on his experiences of blindness, and his experiences are quite individual, I suppose, to him as well. But after we met him, we asked him if the tapes were still in existence, and one day he sent them to us, a box of about 16 C90 cassettes, which hadn't been played in about 25 years, I think, and we began kind of excavating the narrative from within that. So that short film that played at Hot Docs was our first attempt to kind of work out how we might try and represent that.
And that was a 3-minute film, is that right?
That was a 3-minute film.
And that won
yeah.
at Hot Docs Best Short Film?
Yeah, having been kind of largely neglected, we didn't have any festival attention for it at all. We struggled to get it anywhere, and then it won at Hot Docs. From there, we kind of we met the New York Times Up Docs team, and they commissioned. The idea was that it would be a series of 3 short films, and that would be the third one. Somewhere along the way, it ended up being made into a single 12-minute short, which then premiered at Sundance in 2014.
And did very well there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And by that point, I think there was a sense of what the wider narrative of a 90-minute film might look like, because that short film was able to demonstrate something of the journey that John went on, and more of how this approach of using actors to lip sync that audio content might work as well. And from that film, we also cut a kind of, I suppose, a pitching trailer, which again took it from being quite an abstract concept on paper of a film about blindness, a documentary that uses actors, to being something I think that people could have some confidence might kind of sustain. Yeah.
Okay. Can we take a look at the clip? And you came from quite a different background, I suppose, than I think most of us who've gone through telly and that sort of thing. That wasn't your experience?
Yeah, no, this is very much our first project. And when I first met Pete, I was still studying. and he was working for a homeless charity. We started making films together very much evenings and weekends. And I think even for the first...
Well, what's your day job?
I was kind of working as a freelance editor, and then doing bits and bobs of directing. I started directing with Archer's Mark, who produced this film, doing some commercial work with them. And Pete and I started working together. We shot a behind-the-scenes film for like an independent rom-com. We met on that. And actually, we also met our cinematographer, Jerry Floyd, and our first producer on the short there. And yeah, I think we were kind of quite aimlessly wanted to make things, but hadn't really found a subject that we felt we could get our teeth into. So it was only really when we kind of came across John and this material that we were able, I think, to really commit to it. But even, as I say, for the first 3 years, it was something that we were doing in and amongst, jobbing work.
I think, again, if we're talking about the ingredients of feature docs, and one of them being cash, another one is usually time, I would say.
Yeah. I think that the project benefited ultimately from the fact that, so when John first shared the tapes with us, we had 16 hours of material, and we just began working through that, trying to make sense of that archive, going up to see John and Marilyn, doing more interviews with them. Over the course of that time, more and more material kind of came to light, these home recordings that they kept in the same period of their family, their children, and John's parents as well. And I think that the thinking time and the development time from that, and obviously at the time we would have loved for it to be kind of commissioned straight away. I mean, even within 6 months we were kind of trying to pitch it with absolutely no success. But ultimately I think it really benefited from that, in terms of we were constantly reworking the material, constantly trying to work out how to shape it. And
how to shape it in terms of a longer form narrative. So if you've got your 3-minute film, it then grows to a 12-minute film, and then you want to turn it into a feature. But was that always the goal from the beginning, or what was it that made you think that there was a feature in there as opposed to a short film?
Well, the diaries are just vast and absolutely, even to the point where we've actually got a kind of virtual reality project that's playing here that also premiered at Sundance alongside the feature, which takes aspects from the diaries that aren't in the film, and we still feel like we barely scratched the surface. And also just the journey that John goes on across that 3 years really needed, a kind of feature film treatment, we feel. So we always knew that would be the goal, but I think that the feature again vastly benefited from the experimentation that we were able to have across those shorts, and I think had it come, I mean it's difficult obviously, it's a chicken and egg scenario, but had it come to fruition any sooner, I think we wouldn't have been able to delve as deeply into the material and spend as much time with John and Marilyn as we did. So. Yeah.
And was it difficult to convince people that there was a feature there?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, why isn't it a radio piece was a question we got constantly. Actually, we got that question at the Q&A yesterday, so it's still not going away. But,
yeah. After the film?
After the film. Yeah.
Okay. And just on that subject of time, though, as well, it's obviously a long time to make the film, and I think most of these films that we're talking about have a fairly long production period, and a large part of that is the edit. And for those of us who are used to making television with usually around 7 weeks to cut an hour film, what sort of time are we looking at for cutting these films that we're discussing today?
Yeah, well, for us it was peculiar because we had a huge pre-edit in that when we went to shoot the film, we had a 90-minute audio edit of the material, and we've been working on that for a number of years, and so then we were going into a process of shooting the visuals for it. So from that point on, it probably resembled more the process of a narrative.
It's quite difficult to pin it down in terms of numbers of weeks. Yeah, it's true.
But then when we eventually, from the period that we stopped shooting those visuals to the period it played at Sundance was only a few months.
Really? So that's relatively short, but obviously you had all that audio cut already. Yeah. And I'm imagining you were quite frugal when you were shooting the drama element of it.
I think we were massively over-ambitious, actually, in the way that we shot the visuals for it, unfortunately. But
why do you think that?
Possibly inexperience, naivety, and there were whole other sways of dream sequences, flights of fancy and whimsy that, in retrospect, might never have worked. Who knows?
But they did work? Is it good to be over-ambitious?
I think it's probably inevitable when you're approaching such a rich kind of source material, and for with the first-time project, we probably wouldn't have had it any other way. And I don't think we would have made the film in this way at all had we known how difficult it would ultimately be. So maybe it's for the best.
That's a shame. But in terms of the ambition, I just generally, if we could open it up, what differentiates a film, a feature doc? What makes a feature doc in terms of its ambition? How do you approach it as a director in a different way to the way that you would approach television? Apart from the fact, yes, you've got hopefully more money and possibly more time in the edit. How long were you in the edit, just out of interest, Anthony?
For which one? For
both of them.
About a year for Ronaldo, probably 9 months. But I had 2 editors for about 6 months for AP, and one editor who was kind of who was on it for about 2 years, kind of part-time, getting stuff. But I mean, those are observational films, and a lot of those are you kind of want the option of being in the edit whilst you're shooting the film, because it's that quite organic process. But it's also, so with something like Ronaldo, we would just uncover everything about him as much as we possibly could. So, if they're big subjects like that and you have the budget and you have to work out that, reasonably, you want it to kind of have a sort of definitive feel to it. You want it to, you feel as though you have to separate it out. I did a retrospective feature doc where the edit was far less, but because it was scripted practically and storyboarded and it was based on interviews, so it kind of varies for the subject matter.
John?
It was my record, this one. 32 weeks.
32 weeks.
Yeah, which was a record. But I think that's the key, is the edit. If you want to, what is one of the features of making a feature? You've just tried to get yourself a long as edit as possible. And even not in terms of number of weeks, is there a way you can spin the edit out so you have the time to shoot, come back? I mean, look, I don't want to shitbag television, because I've made a lot of television. I made Britney's Redneck Roots, for Channel 4. So I don't want to be a snob about feature docs and TV, because I think that's a dangerous place. And I also feel that there are some feature docs that shouldn't be feature docs. I've made one myself, and I think that, I don't want to get into this, but I think that's partly a problem now. What we were talking about before is that I think the economics of television now means that there is less ambition. There is a model where, you've got 10 to 15 shoot days if you're lucky, then you've got to cut it in, 7 weeks is a luxury now, maybe 5 to 6 weeks. And they don't want you to be ambitious, because that gets in the way. If you're a director who says, no, I want this and I want that, within reason, but you don't. And I think that's one of the reasons, like you were saying beforehand, is why I moved towards making feature docs. And it's not, you hear these budgets, but there's a lot of the time where you're not working at all. It's not ideal, and they take longer. But if you want that ambition, you need a longer edit, because you are making a film that could play at 90 minutes. That's a lot of gears in terms of your narrative. You go to the cinema and a lot of drama can't sustain for 90 minutes, and you are in competition. If you want your film to go into a cinema, which for me is the biggest buzz, to have your film play on a big screen with an audience who react to it, then I think you have to be conscious of that while you're making it. We went to the Michael Moore interview yesterday, and it was interesting. He said he puts a cinema seat in the van, so his crew, when they're going around making a film, knows we are making this. There's one person missing from this crew. I know it's nuts. He's nuts in a good way, but that's Cherry say. There's a missing member here, and that is the audience. And there are things that you do. I did things in this film that Louis initially didn't agree about, because I was conscious that, if we put that in, if you put that in the first 5 minutes of the film and it gets a laugh, you've got them for the next 10 or 15 minutes. It is slightly manipulative, but I think...
That isn't all filmmaking, to a certain extent.
Yeah, I don't want to get into that, But I think you have to be conscious of that, and I don't think you're cheapening a documentary aesthetic, as long as you keep that relationship between the real, then
so you're making a film for a cinema audience, and do you think that's the case with everyone here? When those films that you're making, are you thinking this is a film that people are going to pay and go and see? It's going to fill cinemas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, grammatically, you want to change it. You want to sort of,
And has that worked out in terms of box office for the films that you've made?
I didn't get here by private jet, but it's kind of like, they do all right. They get representation and they get a lifespan. It's you're not going to compete with the kind of big Marvel sort of films, but they have a life.
I'd slightly qualify what I said. I don't mean just, to get into Odeon multiplexes, but even to play at festivals like this, to play on a big screen with an audience, you need to be confident that you're going to have something that's going to sustain an audience sitting in that dark room for, because people steer here, apart from all these people with badges, but a lot of, normal people come to the festival screenings as well, and they pay money for their tickets, and it's a big deal to ask someone to pay 10 quid to come and... So I think that should be a conscious decision, particularly while you're cutting the film, and you need time, man, in that edit.
And in terms of the other decisions that you make, particularly stylistically as a director, are you thinking when you approach a feature doc, how can I give this another layer? How can I give this something that gives you more than what you would see on television or in a standard documentary, however you want to describe that? Are you looking for something else?
Yes, I think it's. I think first of all, just following what John says, I think you have to fight your corner so hard. It's going to take a year of your life, probably at least. I think, and you have to just say, this is the time in the edit I need, minimum 20 weeks, I think. You have to say, we need to be able to afford these lenses, this DOP, a composer, a sound designer, the proper time in post. You can't sort of say, it's a TV program with a few add-ons. You have to say, this is the package, and really fight for it, because the difference it makes at every single stage of that, when you get into the post, there's a proper mixer. George at Molyneux has done the last two of mine. He's a fantastic mixer, but you've got to have that, because people are going to be hearing it off the biggest speakers whatever. So I think it's about, and sound design, obviously critical, brilliant sound, location sound recording, critical. So I think it's kind of thinking about the whole package. And then I think the other thing is critical, obviously, stupid point, but the selection of the story. I would say this sounds so simplistic, but the rule of thumb, I think, is either access to extraordinary characters or an extraordinary story. But it's got to have some element of bigness to it, of kind of universality. And I think if you've got a great subject, it will be multi-layered, and suddenly you start to see all the richness that will come in the 90 minutes. But I think when you're searching out that subject, and this comes from the pain and hell that is development for these kind of films, is you just need to be able to kind of look at that whole story and think, look at that, look at that, look at that, look at all the underlayers and the tiramisu of stuff in there that you can get to grips to, and that then leads you to the visual style that you'll shoot it in. But I do think everything is different. Everything has to be thought of as to how it will play, or how people will feel. I think that's almost what you're doing more than anything, is you're all the time trying to work on the feeling that you are hoping people will have at that moment in time in the film, and what they'll leave the cinema with at the end.
And in terms of the choices that you're making about the key people you're working with, the DOP, but I would say particularly the editor and the composer, are you looking over the other side of the fence into the feature film world and thinking that the grass is greener on that side and choosing some of those people to work with? And if you have done that, what have your experiences been like?
I think it depends on each film. I think, especially in the post-process, I've kind of gone for people in the film world because, as I said, putting something on the big screen is a pretty unforgiving kind of format. It exposes you, and any kind of observational film, you can't always guarantee getting great sound at source, and you realise when, if you see movies being made, a lot of it is done in ADR and it's kind of manipulated, in post. So you kind of, like you're saying, it's not just the offline, but in the kind of that post process as well. You want it, and also because I think film people will build in. They'll have a different way of introducing elements to things, But at the same time, I don't want to lose track of people who have, you know, cut their teeth on TV like I did, you know, who and the kind of DOPs that I've worked with have either come up through that route and either only do now theatrical docs or they do dramas or movies. So you want to be able to kind of know that they have that kind of that rounding experience. And
that's an important point, actually, and it's a tricky. It sounds such a cliche thing to say, but you do walk a line. The film that I did have in the cinema that shouldn't have been there, and it had American financiers, and they did that. You know, first of all, they were like, "So where's the script?" And you're like, it's a documentary, and you're immediately thinking, shit, we could be fucked here. But they insisted that we had to have, you know, that's what I think, that the danger is, if you go too far into the film world and lose touch with the documentary. They insisted we had a DOP that had worked on movies. So we ended up with this guy who'd, I should be careful who I am. Anyway, we ended up with this guy who'd worked on some American movies, and, you know, for the first 2 or 3 interviews, he'd set up this lovely frame, and I'm not a director that looks at the monitor while I'm shooting an interview. I'm looking at the person I'm interviewing, and it all seemed fine. And then after the first couple of days, we got the rushes back, and I realised this guy wasn't even listening to what was being. He was sort of zooming in and getting nice framing. So he zoomed right in the middle of the story he's telling, and we had to fire him, and it was. So I think you need to stay, and I try and shoot with people that have a documentary sensibility. There's a danger of going too far into the movie world and getting people that don't have that documentary connection.
I mean, I can imagine in my experience as well that your DOP you would bring with you from docs, but that sometimes you experience perhaps a snobbery around editors, composers, in terms of the financiers, if they're feature film people. Is that something that you've experienced before?
Yeah, I mean, I had to fight for some editors, and it was fine in the end. It all worked out really well. But yeah, you do get that pressure. You know, you get that pressure from people. And again, it was, you know, Americans. This is a studio, and they're like, well, you gotta have this guy, and you kind of have to argue the toss, and you just have to kind of stick with it. But again, it's that sort of just being faithful to your genre and knowing your craft and having that faith in that, and kind of just being able then to kind of justify it and sort of explain these are the reasons why. But I've had that. I've been saddled with people who've got amazing, glittering film CVs, and, you know, for whatever reason, it just hasn't worked out. And, you know, you can have multiple credits on a fantastic, you know, movies, but all you've done is operate boom, and you never mixed. And if you're trying to make an observational film with multiple radio mics, you're mixing as you go along. These guys are kind of lost at sea, you know. So it's just being able to kind of see that and being able to kind of, you know, work with the producers and sort of say, well, look, you know, this is how I want to lay it out, this is the methodology, these are the people, this is the reasons why, and hope that, you know, you'll be able to sort of they'll make you make the film you want to make.
But in terms of those key roles, do you think there are people who would have feature film sensibilities in terms of the way that they would approach a film aesthetically, creatively? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the film I've just done, I deliberately want, because there's a sort of movie within a movie concept in our film, and it's all set in LA. There's sort of, well, not noir elements, because it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I wanted someone that could give me that sort of rich movie score, and my first reference point was Chinatown. I kind of want a funny Chinatown score. And so we went to the guy did he did an amazing job on scoring our film, and it's one of the reasons I think our film does play well in a screening room is, you know, the soundtrack is crucial, and our line producer Vanessa did an amazing deal with the Welsh National Orchestra, and we recorded our soundtrack live, and it's a live score that plays in the film, and you feel it in a screening room, and it's a big factor.
And also, in terms of the other elements, and you sort of touched on them earlier, and when you were trying to come up with the idea that elevated this above being something that Louis could do on TV, there are other filmic references in the film, in terms of the recon or drama element?
Well, I'm going to slightly contradict this now, because the drama, I mean, I don't want to get into a discussion about recon, because that's, Jesus, that's that's quite a headfuck in itself.
Why would you not want to get into that?
Because it's, I mean, I have a very, personal take, but it's...
Which is?
Well, I don't like it to be too slick. I don't want it to look too much like drama. I don't want it to jar with I don't want to get into all that. But basically, and also, so the recon stuff we did...
No, but that's interesting. Why don't you want it to look too slick?
Well, I don't generally, because I just find it jars with your documentary material. I find as a viewer, that's a personal thing that it jars. But in terms of this film, it's Louis. We're not going to pretend that Louis, some great auteur. We want, our reference was Ed Wood. We wanted to make it look deliberately amateurish, which I know is a good cop out. But it's this idea that Louis is trying to make his first movie. It's not going to look like Chinatown. It's going to have that Ed Wood. We want to see the scenery slats and all that kind of stuff.
So it's intentionally lo-fi in a way.
Yeah, intentionally rubbish.
But James, you've sort of gone the other way with yours. I'm not saying that John's film isn't beautiful, but it is a very beautiful film. It is a film that feels cinematic, and we talked briefly earlier about what that even means, cinematic. But how did you go about achieving that approach, and who were the key people that you involved?
Yeah, I think just because of the nature of the material, in that, as we were saying earlier, it delves into John's dreaming life, his memory, his sort of crisis of identity, and it's also a very sensory account about kind of sound and touch and perception. We felt that this approach was essential in order to be able to get at that very internal material. So we kind of began collaborating from the very first short film. We kind of kept the same team all along the way, really. Our cinematographer, Jerry Floyd.
And what was his background?
His background is in drama, actually. Yeah, he's semi-retired, absolutely wonderful Irishman, lovely. Same with our production designer, Damien Craig. So
it's got a very high-end feel to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It looks good. But again, you're going into it making this, thinking that it's going to be cinema. And do you have particular references in terms of the look that you want to achieve with that?
I think very much our starting point was really just was always with the material and with John's account, and stage by stage, really, because it is such an internal journey. I think in that sense, we approached the visualization with some trepidation, because we also wanted to not give the audience a kind of privileged position, and for not to be, we tried to, in some ways, in terms of how we visualized it, kind of work against some of the conventional grammar of cinema. So we tried to frame out the faces, the eyes of supporting characters, and kind of never have clean establishing wide shots and things like that, and use the kind of limitations of the frame to kind of disorient the viewer, I suppose. And yeah.
Okay. And in terms of the ratio you're shooting at, I'm not sure, Louise, what were you shooting at? Mm-hmm. Is it 2:3:5, the ratio you're shooting at?
Yes.
Are you using anamorphics?
No, we're kind of poor man's anamorphics. Cropped it.
Okay, so it was a crop that you put on in the edit.
Yes, yeah.
So you letterboxed it. Mm. And does that make it look more like cinema?
I think so. I love it. I mean, I just love that aspect ratio, and I would love to have shot on anamorphic lenses. It wasn't quite appropriate or proper for the two films, but I would absolutely love to do that, because I think that's all part of it. All of those things, I think just the sort of consideration of all of those things are really important, because they all have such a sort of massive impact on how you'll kind of receive the film and experience it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And you made that decision as you were shooting, it wasn't something that you...
Yes, it was something we talked about before, and I think one thing I was just going to say, just coming back to what we were talking about earlier, is that I think the kind of really, really, really giving a load of consideration to your heads of department is just critical, because they will, particularly in feature docs, they will all bring, if it works well, such a huge percentage to the film. And I think it can be quite a struggle, because the stakes are so high if they're not people that you're going to work well with. Ideally, you would find a way to experiment with them, do an ad with them or something, but because again, the score, if a composer's score works, it can bring such another level to the film. So it's kind of absolutely key, vital.
Okay. And it's interesting, I know James came from a different background, but just the experience that you've had in television, would you say that for directors who want to have quite a strong creative vision for their film, that there is less opportunity to do that on television now, particularly in single docs?
Let's all end our TV careers. Honestly, yeah, I do think there is. I think there is. I've worked on, a couple of TV docs over the last few years, and there was explicitly less ambition. They just weren't interested. And it's kind of sad. It's not the case for all television, but I think, it's harder to have, and I understand it's the economics now, it's harder to have singles. It just is. It's all, thanks to Making of a Murderer, everyone now wants a bloody series. Even in this world. I've just cut a taster for you for a potential feature doc, and the commissioner's first question was, could it possibly be a box set? And it's like, no. Thankfully, he agreed with that. He backed it. But, the fact that question is immediately asked now. What?
I think it was a test.
What do you mean a test?
As in he didn't want that.
Oh, right.
Yeah. The first thing he said to me was, he wants to win an Oscar. So that was
great. No pressure. I thought it was hard enough just making an out-and-out cinema film.
Yeah. There you go. But it's a different kind of aspiration for a film, I suppose. And as a director, is that the allure, the potential, the big screen, you're the director, it goes to Sundance, it wins awards?
I'm sure you all agree. It's dangerous getting into that when you start out to making a film. I just think you have to try and, like Louise said, you've got to try and find a subject that warrants big screen. And just think about it playing on the big screen. It was an interesting experience for me doing this with Louis. Louis had absolutely no interest in the aesthetics of the film. He didn't care how it looked, and kind of nor should he really. He is a journalist at heart, and he's not. I had to say, look, I'm going to be changing lenses occasionally. And he was like, oh God. And there's a sequence in our film where we have this sort of travelling band of actors with us, and we wanted people to genuinely see what happens when you go through the first stages of Scientology, not just the holding the cans of the e-meter, but the training routines you go through. And so we were going to spend a whole day shooting this, and Louis was like, well, you and Will, my DOP, you can have a 3-martini lunch today and just pop in and out and grab little bits. And we were like, no, it's got to be a proper sequence, and we constructed it in a studio, and we wanted to make it look kind of sci-fi. And I think you do have to be prepared. I know it's potentially a dirty word in docs, but constructing. It's like what you were saying, Anthony, about the opening sequence you wanted to have for Ronaldo. I think you have to start with that ambition, because it's going to be on a big screen.
It does help if you love cinema. I used to bunk in to go and see movies, and I like that immersive experience. I like the fact that you are just, everything's dark and you're there, and it's all very emotional, and you're kind of locked in. I think that kind of really helps. There was this thing that when starting out doing the theatrical docs, an exec at BBC Films said, why don't you use this device in the edit, because it's quite useful. It's like Michael Moore having the chair in the car, and that basically you cut a piece of paper, it's about the length of the monitor, and that monitor could be something like that, or whatever, but you cut a piece like this, and it should be about this big, or however big the monitor is, and you draw these like semicircles on it, and you're thinking, what on earth are you doing, like that, and then you cut round it, and then you put that at the bottom of the monitor. And what that represents are the backs of heads. And once you do that, you completely look at the screen in a different way, and it affects how you then go and shoot. It affects how you cut, how long you stay on a cut. It's just a really simple device, and it was from a person who was just brought up in film and said, here's a very quick thing, put that on there, and it helps you kind of recalibrate and think, we're making a film now.
Very good. I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions now.
It's actually just a really quick question. I think there's one film, James, we haven't heard the budget for your film, I believe.
It was about 800,000.
Sorry?
800,000. Yeah.
Thanks. That's all.
Hi. I'm interested in the chain of command above the director. You know, who's giving you notes, and what sort of notes are you getting on your films?
Go first.
Basically, the financiers were the executive producers on both of these two films. So essentially, Joe Oppenheimer, Christine Lang, and Lizzie Frankie from the BFI, and they're great people to have in the back of the room. You know, they're very, very experienced and very smart. It really helped on Dark Horse. I had a producer, Judith Dawson, who's really very editorial. She was a journalist for many, many years, and I found that incredibly helpful. So she was a great foil. So we would constantly talk about the film as we were going through. Sometimes in feature docs, the producer is more of a kind of finance person, but I found it incredibly helpful to have that person on the road that we could just talk through the story with constantly, and who could also manage taking a film into a small community, because sometimes if you are making a feature doc and you bring your quite big apparatus into a small community, you really need somebody who understands how to keep that soft.
I think it is like, I mean, it depends who you're making the film for. I mean, we had, like you guys, we had BBC Films, and it was quite, the first rough cut viewing was and Christine Langan, who's, super smart film exec, you do get kind of slightly different notes from film people. They're more like conceptual statements. In TV, you get quite specific notes.
Yeah.
It's like
descriptive.
Yeah. And in film, and the first screening we had, and the room goes quiet, and Christine looked up, and she said, "So what have you cut?" And she meant, what have you cut out? But Louis, who's very much used to getting notes in that television world, he was like, "What do you mean? What have we cut? We've cut that." He wasn't quite used to these. They're quite more sort of haiku, gnomic, and he found that, I think, in the first couple of screenings, challenging.
But is it also challenging, again, my experience having multiple voices in a room, as opposed to, you're used to working in television, you get a single commissioner and you're really working to their notes, whereas if you're making a feature film, generally there are multiple financiers, there are multiple producers, and there are often notes from all those different sources which can be conflicting. So how do you manage that? I've had screenings where there have been about 25 people in the room, including the contributors, and you've had to sort of fight your corner, and it's a 3-hour, and it's rigorous, and that's, but that's part of the fun. I mean, it's kind of, that there are, if it's a single source commission from a studio, what have you, then you deal with the execs that are there, and they have a hierarchical system, and they will come in, and there's usually, they don't like to travel just by themselves, so they will have an entourage, and they will have an opinion, and you deal with those notes, but you will have your team, so it is like television in that sense, that you do get notes, but it is less just of the note of hanging on the whim of one individual. So in some ways that can make it easier, because you can navigate through those and you don't have one single person who's dictating how the film should be.
if that single person is good at their job, and then yeah, it's a luxury. But if they're not, then it's a pain.
If you disagree with them, it's a pain.
Well, yeah, and it's just yeah. But it's it's one of the interesting things is that they find is that they kind of are interested in you getting to a space where you can make a decision about it. It's not like a diktat, partly because that's imposed on them because there's a delivery date and there's a finite amount of money and time, and you've got to get that film out in television. But with films, like, okay, well, what do we think? Could we explore it like this? And that, in a sense, because it is more director-led like that, you try to work out those problems, and they're sort of more like puzzles more than anything else. From what I remember with television, it needs to be more prescriptive. Because,
was it that long ago?
I don't know, a while ago, yeah. But no, I've done a few little things for television, and I had similar things where it's like it's got to get out.
Can we have another question? Who is choosing the question? Am I choosing the question?
Who are you choosing?
Okay.
You're the chair.
Yeah, I've never been the chair before.
Hiya. You've talked a lot about all of your films have very big budgets, and I'm wondering about the likelihood of a film on a small budget making it to the big screen, and whether that's just a pipe dream or not.
It's a good question. It is a good question. Yeah, I mean, it does happen. It just doesn't happen as much. And yeah, I mean, it goes without saying we are all extremely privileged to have worked on films, particularly Anthony with his budget. I'm joking. But yeah, it is. I mean, it happens. It's just. I do think you do need, or you need to have an alternative stream of income yourself. I mean, I'm quite old school. I like to try and make a living out of this. Which is, in all seriousness, another thing I do is I make commercials. I mean, that enables me, on my film, it had a great budget, but I was budgeted to working on it for 1 year, and probably like all you guys, producers get you on a buyout, a flat fee, because they know we ain't paying this guy, because we know it's a feature doc, it's going to run over. Our film probably took, with all its, I see our film's lawyers sitting in the second row, with all the legals on our film, which probably added an extra 6 months, it took 2 years, and I was on a buyout, and the way I made that work was I made a dog food commercial in St. Louis halfway through. But I mean, yeah, I'm sure that, it'd be interesting to know what cinematic documentaries on low budgets have made it.
I think I certainly met people at Sundance who'd bought films there, and they had made them for very little. So it is possible. But generally speaking, they had done it. They hadn't taken a salary on the film. They'd found a way to borrow a C300. They paid their way to do it. And that's tough. I mean, fantastic if you have the desire and the will to do it. So I think it's wrong to think you can't move before you've gathered £800,000, but it probably won't be that easy. But maybe that's the point,
And is that because partly the bar is so high now as well?
Well, I suppose it's partly, again, sort of what we were talking about is that just the time to get the top talent that you want to work with you, to film on the cameras you want and on the lenses you want. I mean, it's an interesting thing that on both films I've done, there's been pickup shots have had to be done, and it's often me that goes and does them on a C300, and it is extraordinary when you see the footage on the big screen. The C300 is great, I might say, but just the richness of the full format, the Alexa, say, it's just different. It's rich, it's luscious, it just looks beautiful up on the big screen. So I think, I guess, if you have the chance to raise the money, those are the kind of things which will help you make your film cinematic. And I think the thing that always hangs over all of us is, it's a bit small screen. That's your kind of nightmare, isn't it? That's the kind of, the frightening words. So that ambition is probably what makes it cost as much as it does.
Okay. Eleanor?
Yeah, it's kind of on the same lines, but I just wanted to be on the kind of difference between there's a lot of talk about the big screen and the small screen, but I don't know, it just seems to me that you go and watch fiction features, and some of them are really trying to emulate documentaries and being that kind of like handheld style, and maybe are we losing some of the kind of authenticity of the doc by trying to make them too flashy, and is there something else that is beyond the kind of like big screen sort of production value thing? Is there something else about a feature doc that, you know, you guys could pinpoint about the sensibility and the way you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I agree, you know, there is this line that it's not scientific, but the film I had that was distributed in a cinema by Miramax that nobody went to see, went the other way. They tried. It just didn't quite have the scale of the story. It was a good story, but it just didn't quite have the scale of the story, the characters. And the co-director, who then came on at that point, as I left, who was an editor, they went the other way and stylized the fuck out of it. Split screens, there isn't a moment where there's a 70s soundtrack, and it's too slick, it's too cinematic, and it didn't work. And you know, one of my favourite fiction films is Feston, which is shot on one of the old, but it's shot by an amazing cinematographer, but they are the exceptions. You know, there are, you know, the sort of Blair Witch version of a documentary that's made for nothing, and you know, my favourite ever documentary, American Movie, you know, I know the filmmaker on that, you know, made that, you know, it's the classic, did it on the credit cards, but they tend to be the exceptions. And if you want to get a film into a cinema, there is an apparatus around it, there's no getting around it. Distributors want to be confident that they've got a film they can market, because that's a lot of money, and so they want to know that it's got a, you know, they want to know it's got name composer on it, possibly. I mean, that film, again, you know, they got Matt Dillon to narrate it. It didn't save it as a film, I personally don't think, but that was one of the things that they tried.
But I think, just to mention that your thing about authenticity, which is a very valid point, because of course you can drift away from the kind of perhaps authenticity of documentary. But I think Fire at Sea, the film out now, maybe even here, is it? I think is a really a fantastic example. I mean, he's obviously, you know, he's a fantastic filmmaker, but his aesthetic is absolutely, truly documentary, but it's something cinematic. You only need to watch the trailer and it makes your heart stop, and you think, I have to go and see that film. And its aesthetic is absolutely documentary, although actually, as you watch it, you're not sure whether you're watching a film or a documentary. So I think it's a really good question. I think it's really important that all forms of documentary are out there and get a life, if possible.
Chap over there.
Hi, thank you. Just a couple of questions. I've produced a few current affairs docs, short, 30 minutes, 48 minutes, but I'm just preparing to produce my first feature doc. It's largely observational, but it also has layers of kind of historical, and I guess there'll be some constructed sequences around it. But first question, just about observation, and when you're filming observationally, and it's about a theatre director who's putting on quite an ambitious play. I just wanted to know what advice you had just in terms of capturing observational stuff to the best quality. But secondly, in terms of preparing narrative, you know, quite often, you know, when you're going out on a shoot, you'll prepare like a sequence list. You have a kind of an idea of the film in your mind before you even go and start shooting. To what extent are you doing that when you are preparing for a feature doc? To what extent have you kind of got the film, you know, just a version of the film at least, mapped out before you start shooting, or are you just like, you know, there's no point doing that, just start shooting first and then slowly you'll find the layers within it?
I mean, it depends on the filmmaker, I guess. I mean, interestingly, I went to the Pennebaker talk yesterday, you know, the Pennebaker, the directors, and they were saying, I mean, they shoot themselves, and for them, they do absolutely no preparation at all, and for them, the film is what they shoot. That gives me the fear. I can't do that. The films I make are very highly constructed, and I like to have a plan when I set out. I mean, you chuck out half of that while you're making it, hopefully, to keep that kind of authenticity. But in terms of observation, just make sure you've got a shit hot observational DOP, not the guy I had who wasn't listening.
Have a good sound man.
Yeah,
Because a lot of observational films are bad because you listen to them. You know, you're listen, if there's multiple things going on, especially if you've got a play, then you are. And if you're lucky enough to put radio mics on your protagonists or your main characters who have agreed to, then listen. And you've got to then work out a good relationship between your sound man, the cameraman, and yourself, whereby you can make kind of split decisions about what gets put in vision. But unless you have the sound, then you have to have that to help tell your story.
We've got time for one more? Oh, you sure? Can we get one? What about Rowan? Can we just have one from Rowan? Yeah. Really? Of course. All right. Well, so sorry.
Aisha's going to ask. Let Aisha ask a question. She always asks really tough questions.
I just wanted to ask what's the feature dog that they would most like to have made?
I think it's The Gatekeepers. The one about Shin Bet, I thought was a masterpiece. Would have loved to have made that. Yeah.
I think for me it's American Movie, which I think is just one of the, not just funniest docs, one of the funniest films I've seen. I think if you, it's not you don't get to see it much. Have you seen it?
Yeah, you can see it online. It's very good.
You don't. I think you can get it on iTunes. How many people have seen American Movie here? Yeah, you should. It's not enough. So I think it's a masterpiece. I mean, it's a great film. That would be mine.
Mine's a golden oldie, Harlan County, USA, which is just a genius film, which just has everything in it you could wish and dream for in a film. Harlan County, USA, Barbara Koppel. It's a great film.
Well, I guess it's quite a mystical question, so I'm just going to go with Don't Look Back, just for the experience, I suppose.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.